Welcome to the Control the Room podcast, a series devoted to the exploration of facilitation and transformative leadership. Some leaders exert tight control and others are loose. To control the room means achieving outcomes while striking a balance between imposing and removing structure, asserting and distributing power, leaning in and leaning out, all in the service of having a truly transformative experience. Thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to join us live for a session sometime, you can join our Facilitation Lab. It's a free event to meet facilitators and explore new techniques so you can apply the things you learn in the podcast in real time with other facilitators. Sign up today at voltagecontrol.com/facilitation-lab. You can also learn more about our 12-week facilitation certification program at voltagecontrol.com. Today, I'm with Leanne Hughes at leannehughes.com, where she helps everyday people design fast and deliver strong without stress. She is also the author of the 2-hour workshop blueprint. Welcome to the show, Leanne.
Douglas, it's always great to chat. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Absolutely. I've been really looking forward to this today. So, as usual, I'd love to start with how you got your start in the world of facilitation and, workshop blueprints and helping people deliver strong without stress. Like, how does someone get into this work?
Well, it's just, scratching my own itch, really. I'm one of those chronic people that just will design and iterate and design, and even the 5 minutes leading up to a workshop do that. But in terms of the start of stepping up in front of a workshop room, I guess I'm probably the participant in a workshop that you'd always want to have in your group, just super eager, on time, asking questions, nodding when things make sense. I just love being in workshops. And I think it stems from, as a kid, I used to play a sport in Australia called netball. I don't know if many of your listeners have heard of that. It's kind of like a combination of basketball and European handball, but it dominated my life. And actually, so much so that I'm in my mid-20s and I'm still playing, and I've gone past the peak of being the athlete I was. And the only reason that kept me in the team was the group dynamics and the teamwork and the friendships and the ability to play with a team and be high performance. So I've always been sort of interested in that. But fast forward a few years, I was living in a remote town in Australia, 2,000 kilometers away from the nearest capital city. So we're basically just locked off from the rest of Australia. And there are opportunities, we didn't have any facilitators in town, and often we'd have to fly facilitators up from different capital cities to run sessions. And we had our local shire actually ask for a session on time management. I was working in a marketing role back then, and I thought, you know what, I read a lot on this. I love talking and being in these groups. Maybe it's a chance to get up there and present. So that was the first opportunity. And Douglas, the run sheet that I had for that session, it was 9:01, show this slide, 9:03, ask this question. It was just, I'm so glad I don't have that run sheet, but it's probably a good example of how far I've come in terms of running workshops.
Yeah, that's so interesting when things get so over-programmed, and it's quite often the mark of someone fresh and new and excited and wants to get it all right, but it actually can be a disservice.
Absolutely. So back to the title of your podcast, Control the Room, that's what I was so uncertain that I had to minutize the agenda. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting you came back to the title because there's different kinds of control. And there's some kinds of control where letting go actually gives us the real control. We're really in control at that point. Everything's going to happen the way it needs to happen. Whereas if we try to exert too much control, then things get out of control.
It's so true. And even when you talk about that first example of control, when I felt like I've relinquished it, it's interesting because even my body feels like it's actually really grounded. I'm really there. I just feel that presence. Whereas at times where I'm kind of off my game, I feel like I'm floating above my head. I don't know. Have you felt that, or is it just me being a bit weird here?
No, it's something that comes up quite often and that we talk about in our certification, which is this idea of being grounded in purpose, and identifying purpose can be really helpful there. But also, there's lots of things that might knock you off that grounding, right? Whether it's an unruly participant, or maybe the food didn't show up on time or whatever. And so I think, it's very human to respond in those kinds of ways, right? And we had to learn how to move through those spaces in ways that allow us to return to that grounding, because it's no such thing as being permanently just glued, right? That's not being human, right? But how do we stay in balance? When we get knocked off, how do we flow back in?
Yeah, I really love that. And there's certain times that I don't know. And there's also like what people see of you projecting versus what you're feeling yourself. Like there was an example a few years ago. I thought the day was going great. And I sort of checked in with a few people at lunch and they're like, Leanne, we're not talking about what we really need to talk about. I was like, okay, what do I do after this break? And so, that definitely asked the group the question. We got into circles, but, inside I was like that duck just like splashing around underwater. I think the perception was I had this under control if people were to look at me. And people have remarked in terms of my facilitation style, they'll say, oh, you look so calm and measured. Honestly, Douglas, on the inside, it's anything but. So it's kind of interesting, the contrast between the inner and the outer game.
Yeah, absolutely. And that duck metaphor comes up quite often. It's like, how do we keep everything calm and placid, even if we're doing a lot of moves underneath the hood?
Yeah. And it's funny, when you are under stress, you can't really think broadly in terms of all the opportunities or options that you have for that moment. You kind of narrow in on like, okay, what about this act? Like my mind it's almost like it's going through this Rolodex of all the things I could possibly do, all the processes I could bring up. But I'm not, if I'm under stress, and so this is why I like having that outer game, kind of slowing down the breathing, that helps me then relax and think more broadly in terms of what's most useful for this group and what questions can I ask to help us continue here and get their thoughts on next steps.
Yeah, the other thing that I've found too is having the awareness and acknowledgement that as the facilitator, I don't have to have all the answers, nor should I. And being in that space and holding that role allows me to invite conversation that might need to happen. And one thing that can be done when things seem to be going off the rails is to label it, name it.
Yes.
Like what I'm noticing here is, and what do you think we might do about that? And that can be a powerful thing, and let the group decide, let them kind of weigh in. And I think my experience is that they respect you for it.
I agree, because you actually are naming it. And I think when we're talking about past Leanne, I never would have been brave enough to even ask that question. And I thought you had to be the capable professional person up there, and ego was attached to that. It is really interesting, the fact that as you graduate from being a facilitator or move on through your journey, you're actually like the control, if we were mapping the control, like it would go the other way.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about, it's a topic that we were discussing in the pre-show chat, and it's very related to this idea of being able to name it, label it. And you were talking about this idea of working in public or co-creating. And so, if we're naming things and just being transparent and vulnerable in that space, that's what it opens the door for folks. And I think, to your point, working in public in any way, that transparency, that door opening is what invites real collaboration.
Yeah. And I think, I've heard the name. I think I first heard Pat Flynn talk about working in public, and I was reflecting on an experience when I was working internally for a big corporate mining company. I was in a learning and development role, and we had a parent company. And often we'd do things like we thought we'd take an initiative, like we'd design the leadership program. Then we would have it finalized and shoot it up to the parent company and say, hey, here's what we created. This is great. We should roll it out across all businesses. And they were really taken aback by that. So rather than being overjoyed that we'd done all the work for them, what we had done was sort of working in private, where we just did everything. We thought it was the right thing, had it perfect before presenting it. And we didn't get buy-in from them at all. In fact, they were kind of pissed off that we did that. So then I thought, all right, okay, so squirreling away working in secret is not a good thing. In certain contexts it is, but in the context that I work in, and which is all about, and you, Douglas, co-creation, group collaboration. Now I'm just trying to get more comfortable in sharing early editions and versions of things as I work on them with a group to get feedback. And I just find it the most amazing way to do things. Like it's how I wrote my book. It's hard to do though, because you're sharing something that's half baked, and that's really uncomfortable.
Yes. So tell me about how you approached your book using this kind of mentality. Yeah,
well, I got the idea from Rob Fitzpatrick, who wrote the Workshop Survival Guide, and he also wrote a book called Write Useful Books. And he said, basically, so I was speaking at a conference in California on February 25th this year. on the 1st of January, I thought, I can't go to California. I can't fly all the way to California from Australia and not have a book. So within 52 days, I got version 1 done. Basically, I mean, I've had, similar to you, I had like 200 interviews on my first time facilitator podcast and just accumulated all this knowledge. So I thought to get this done, that was easy. But then I threw it out for feedback. So the version 1 of the book, I handed out at the conference with a very big disclaimer and a QR code. Click here to give feedback. Like, you're a part of an early edition. And it was great. So for 2 things. One, it validated the idea. I actually had someone come up to me and say, oh my gosh, I'm actually running a 2-hour workshop in 2 weeks. Like, okay, this is the book. I'm solving a problem. But also the feedback was so interesting and fantastic. But I kind of, before even jumping onto the platform to review it, I really had to put myself in a state where I'm like, okay, Leanne, whatever you're reading here it's not feedback on you. It's feedback on this idea and the concept. So take that.
So I'm sure with all the feedback you've got, that some of that feedback was surprising to you. So when you think about all the surprising feedback that you got, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I think one of the core elements of the book originally was creating it was when you run a workshop, like create a framework around your content. And I'd feedback that that's kind of the next level. It's too hard for that level. And so it was good because it kind of reminded me of who the reader was. Another bit of feedback was Leanne used way too many metaphors. There's too many mixed metaphors in this book. And I thought metaphors were a good thing. Like, I intentionally put lots of metaphors in there. The third thing was I thought I was writing in a really short, punchy way. It's a short book, but it wasn't punchy enough. And I think in one of the chapters, someone said, I think chapter 5, it took them maybe 3 pages in to get to the core message. And it was kind of brutal that, like, you don't need all this, but thank goodness that's been washed out before it goes into the final version.
I love that. I love this process. And interestingly enough, it's how I wrote my book, Beyond the Prototype. We didn't use that process with Magical Meetings because I had a publisher who was giving me like plenty of feedback. But it was really fun to write in that way. And I think you're expressing some getting over a bit of fear or uncertainty around it. And I think I personally was lucky that I kind of came up through this world of software development where we were constantly like doing reviews and talking about things and trying things out and seeing if they would work. And so I was very used to working in that way, right?
It's interesting you pull that up. I definitely see that software tech. I mean, we can see ChatGPT now on its 4th or 5th iteration, right? Just putting it out to the world as an early edition, getting feedback to improve the model. But in a lot of organizations, this is a really new concept. They don't even think about sharing what's going on behind the scenes or what they're working on. It's all hidden behind closed doors. And there's a real fear of being judged, I feel.
Yeah. And also another thing I see, even companies that are used to doing it, they're used to doing it in certain contexts, in certain departments. And so you look at a company that does a lot of prototyping on their design team, they might not be doing prototyping in their meetings where it's like, we could come and build a thing together and experiment with it. There's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, how many companies have innovation in their corporate values, yet it's like, oh, we only innovate on product or service. We don't innovate in how we work or what, you know what I mean? It's like, it's not really a core value. It's just only for a certain amount of people or departments, but if it's a core value, how are you living that through the business?
Like every way, like where's your innovative parking or where's your innovative ride sharing to work or whatever it is, right?
Love that. Yeah, that's a cool idea.
So often when we're talking with facilitators that are working as full-time facilitators, they're contractors or freelancers, or maybe they have a small professional services agency, they think about that client relationship. But that's another lens that, similar to the prototypes, that we don't necessarily see with everyone who's facilitating inside of companies. It's something that you and I were talking about, this kind of thinking about the peer-to-peer relationship that really needs to exist for the best work to be done in the facilitation context, really any collaboration context. How have you seen that show up in this kind of facilitator-client relationship when it comes to in-house, like in-house facilitators?
Well, I think one thing, there's a brand about L&D still hasn't really been dismissed, I don't think. I think maybe some people have worked on their brand, but it's really around L&D just being the order takers. So the operational leaders will say, this is what we need. we need more of a focus on safety, right? Then they'll go to L&D and go create a safety program. We need it, and they'll give them the detail of it, right? So just go, it needs to be 90 days and we need to make it virtual. So that is like a parent-child. You're just throwing them the instructions and please create this. Whereas the peer-to-peer would be safety program. Let's work shoulder to shoulder and really figure out, do some interviews, what is actually required, what are the observed behaviors we need to change and things like that. And I don't know if I'm not too sure if it's set up in the structure as well. It's really quite funny, Douglas. When we're talking about the business of facilitation, I had Alan Weiss on my podcast, who I now got as a business coach, because he just basically every 2 seconds was just a value drop. Something that he said, I can't believe I'm sharing it here, but it relates to this theme of the brand of learning and development. He said to me, Leanne, do you know what HR stands for? Have you heard this, Douglas, what he thinks it stands for? Mm-mm. He said, hardly relevant. And I was like, what do you mean by that? And he goes, they have no budget, they have no decision power, right? And so this is what's going on. And you do mention HR. They've tried to rebrand to different, people and capability, talent and development, but it's still, the legacy of that continues. And it's sad, because I've come from that world. And even in my own marketing externally, I've really had to shift the perception of not being just a facilitator. We can talk about that word a bit later on, or in learning and development, more about being a strategic advisor. I think the language we use around the description of the service needs to change. But also the way of thinking around the best way to approach something also needs to change, because training, everything that we thought was working, there's so much in terms of value and new things that we can be bringing out, and being more responsive to what the organization actually needs.
Yeah, it really matters. And I think what he's hitting on is this notion that HR is a cost center, right? They're not a value generating entity in the organization. And that, I think that perception of HR is unfortunately one that permeates a lot of organizations, right? So they don't tend to get the kind of investment that sales gets, for instance, right? Or even product development, because they look at product as, well, if we invest in product organization, they're going to create more innovation, which will create more value, and we can sell more of that value, right? Mm-hmm. That's ultimately what they're looking at in a capitalist kind of equation. Yeah,
and I think it's a good consideration. And so in terms of if for L&D departments wanting to build their brand, it's like, okay, what's that dotted line between what you did and the return on investment and the performance? And I think the measures aren't that good. Definitely suggest a link to Kevin Yates's work. He calls himself the L&D detective. Nice. I don't know if you know. Yeah. So he talks about measurement. I think that's crucial. If we're looking at building a peer-to-peer relationship, whether it's internal or external, how are you communicating the value in terms of business results and performance? Not just, we improved the engagement scores. No one cares about that.
To what end,
no business
right?
leader cares. Yeah. Yeah.
And, you look at companies that are adopting OKRs or other kinds of strategy rollout mechanisms. And anytime that work can be aligned with that, it can be a really powerful way to ensure that the measurement is aligning with the objectives that have been set forth that are most important.
That's it. Yeah, it's just getting that alignment and making sure that you can demonstrate that value.
Yeah, another thing I was thinking about was how often there's no rubric or success criteria defined for a lot of this work, right? And so it's not only measuring, you can't really measure what you haven't decided how you're going to measure. Mm-hmm. Right?
That's right. Yeah. So try to write a proposal. I mean, when you're an external, but I mean, I kind of wish I had external consulting experience before I moved internal as well. I mean, they're both just very parallel skills in terms of how do you measure the difference between your intervention, your series of workshops, the coaching work that you're doing. What's the measurable objective out of that? Mm. But then the good thing about that is then you got to ask, well, will a workshop help get you there? Maybe a leader needs to change roles. Maybe that there's more. A workshop is part of the solution. I think where L&D can kind of fail, and where I failed in my first few years is that because I'm a workshop facilitator, my prescription was a workshop. I wasn't thinking more broadly. So that's what's really shifted for me in terms of present Leanne, is actually thinking, okay, the workshop is might be part of the solution, but it's not everything that this client requires to get the result they're after.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. And I think that really interesting to hear this journey. What do you think was the moment that clicked for you that not everything's a workshop and I need to think more holistically?
It was honestly working with Alan Weiss. So he basically disrupted the podcast. Like everyone went nuts over this interview. It was a watershed moment for me. The whole time I'd gone on my own solo, I was marketing myself as a facilitator, as a person that run workshops. When people contacted me, they got a workshop. Then I sent Alan a few of my proposals for clients, and he just basically knocked them down, was very brutal, and said, yeah, what are you doing? So I got my head checked in a gloriously kind way to get violent feedback. It was good. Yeah. So amazing. We need people in our lives that do that for us. And I've had wonderful coaches. I think my first coach was very kind and lovely, but more of a cheerleader, and there wasn't much growth. But with him, it's been brutal. It's been hard. I've had to really think about things and decide what to take on or not. But one of the biggest influences in my career, I would say.
Amazing. Yeah. A solid coach can make a big difference.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned something else in the pre-show chat around this idea of how being a podcast host can be really informative and how you facilitate and the style that you bring into facilitation. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that because it resonated with me. But before I start to share my thoughts, I want to hear a little bit more about what that surfaces for you.
Well, I mean, the fact that we're talking, I think is fantastic. And if you're listening to this, I'm sure you can hear like the rhythm, cadence, and difference between Douglas and I. And you can imagine a different type of workshop experience. Douglas, you're way more thoughtful and intentional, I think, with what you say. Will just run off. My mouth talks before I connect it to my brain. So would have very different workshop experiences. And that's why I was just keen to riff with you on that. But I did start my podcast when I was a first-time facilitator working internally. My boss sent me to Canada. I had no idea how to run these workshops. And so I was looking for podcasts back then and couldn't find anything. So I started this podcast when I was working in a business. But what probably the best unintended side effect was, as a result of hosting the show and having all these conversations where you're listening in, you're having to segue and transition, which for the first 50 episodes I was terrible at. Again, I had a script of questions. Was that my growth as a facilitator it just exploded as a result of being a podcast host. What have you discovered?
Yeah, it's fascinating to me, the listening skills that it requires, just the intent listening, especially to your point early on. I showed up with a list of questions and I quickly realized how difficult it was to have a good podcast with just a list of questions. So I wanted to shift it to be more conversational. And as soon as you do that, you have to really listen. And, there's some guests like you, for example, where the conversation is natural. There's some guests where the conversation is not natural. And you really have to work hard and listen really hard. I've thought as a facilitator, I'm a pretty good listener, really good at rapid synthesis. But once you're trying to capture a moment with someone and really get a good recording and really make the conversation live, it's like facilitating one person, right? You can't just like jump to someone else in the room and have the beauty of the room intelligence erupt. It's like, no, you gotta like really pull it out of that person. And so that intent listening and also synthesizing and thinking about where am I going to nudge this so I get them talking. That's
I love the way that you put that, facilitating one person. You're right. And I've definitely had those situations where it's been kind of disjointed and like we haven't really built up a drum beat or a rhythm. And the other point that you mentioned in terms of, oh, wow, this person said 5 different things. We could go in 5 different directions here. Which one do I take? And often, actually, people have written to me saying, oh, how did you know I was going to ask that question? And it basically is just going into, I think, and again, like I said, if the first time I had that script, I wouldn't have gone to that question. But when I relinquished control, I just put myself in the scenes like you said to Douglas before the show, if we were just having a coffee, what would I actually naturally just ask that person? And I go with that one, as opposed to having to be performative.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really like to interview or talk to my guests ahead of time unless I am not sure if it's going to be a good episode. If I want to get a good read on, who is this person? Is there going to be but if I have an understanding or an intuition that it's going to be good, I just go with it because it's going to be so much better to have it be organic.
Yeah, there's nothing worse when you've heard the story a second time.
And have to feign interest, right? It's like in the birthday present nobody wants.
Yeah, that's it.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the book because that's exciting. We talked about the process by which you wrote the book. I think it'd be neat to talk about Spark for a little bit here, and especially Keep, because that's the big innovation for you. But I think for listeners, it'd be helpful to hear what Spark is, and then maybe we can dive into that Keep piece that's particularly special.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on who. I think people will pick up different elements. So Spark is the framework that underpins the whole book. Basically, it's talking through how to set up your workshop, how to power it up and get people engaged immediately, how to structure your agenda with activities, the reflection piece to close off your workshop. So we all know this format, right? We all know it. This is the book that I would have loved 6 years ago. And then Keep is the part. First of all, I'm like, Keep. Do I keep this K in? I'm like, actually, this is really important. I think this is probably the geeky stuff that people don't talk about because it's not glamorous at all. It's like what happens after the workshop. And so one of my values is like working with clients is responsiveness and something, speed is more important than content sometimes in the world that we're living in. And often what I was really bad at was I'd finish a workshop, I'd probably be tired. I might be traveling. And so when I got the resources that I promised in the workshop to them, it would be like a week later, which is not good enough. So what I do ahead of time is I tend to know what resources I recommend. There's like a top 10 list, like my favorite leadership books. I've got a Spotify playlist of my favorite leadership podcast episodes that I've curated on particular themes. So if we're talking about psychological safety, I've got a podcast playlist for that. And then I've got this Notion template set up with all my resources. So post-workshop, I just duplicate it, edit things around, throw in some photos or quotes from the day and get that out to the client very quickly, like within 6 hours of the workshop being done. They don't have that cognitive overload and the weight of having to do that as well. Like the workshop is over. The other part of Keep, which I'll just quickly share, is what do we do with do we ever reflect on our workshops, how activities worked, what could have been tweaked, the variations of that? So I'll actually schedule time in my calendar post-workshop. I print out my run sheets. I know that's very old school. Like I've tried to use the iPad, but I actually like having paper there that I can quickly jot notes down on. And I've actually just got a display folder here with every single run sheet I've run for workshops, and I'll annotate over the top very quickly. So when I go to design again, I can just flick through my previous run sheets and pick those things out that worked. So, it's just my process of doing things faster, but also not losing the learnings that I'm getting from every session.
It reminds me of it's like the operations of being a facilitator and really embracing the fact that how do we make this efficient, repeatable, make it easier?
Yeah, because I think there's a tendency that even if you're running the same session, we all have this tendency I need to change it up because even if it's a completely new group, they've never seen it before, like to keep it fresh for ourselves. But one thing I also remind myself of is that every workshop is a once in a lifetime experience. Like it's never going to be the same. So that helps get me through. Do you have a process?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a CTO for many years and software developer, so I'm a procedural thinker and I have tons of process, including lots of Zap and Zapier, if you know what that is. And in fact, whenever we define a repeatable type of workshop that we like to run, we will create a configuration file for that workshop that'll include a mural or a Miro and a slide deck and it'll point to the master versions for that particular type. So when I say I want to do that again, it just duplicates it all and puts it all in the right places. And then I'm off to the races. And then if it's anything custom, we just choose the custom option, which also is a set of all those things, but it's more of a blank slate, or it has all the building blocks that we need. Because then whatever we're doing for that custom might turn into one that we do again sometime. And so the system's kind of set up to where we can just kind of capture those things. So that's like an example. Like we get pretty nerdy on it.
I love, great. I really love hearing how you actually do this and how I've had, even people, just using Google Slides and having that, the master one there and then editing. And I love hearing this stuff because it really does make a difference in terms of the ability to design fast is actually quite important. Like if you want to take on new work, in my first few years building this business, I was saying yes to every type of workshop, right? So I had to build rapidly. Otherwise I wouldn't be able to do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we're kind of coming up on time. I want to think about where do you see the future going? Everyone's, of course, talking about AI these days, and it seems especially when you're talking about systems and designing fast, how much is AI showing up in your systems and fast designing these days?
Yeah, so even talk about this in the book. Something I think is important to get, I talk about getting people to your actual workshops, because often people sign up and they don't come along. So one thing I love using AI, I know ChatGPT isn't all of AI, but even just getting brainstorming prompts on what am I going to call this workshop? I've used it in the book. I talk about if you want to get a case study, imagine you're a procurement manager, you're working for this company, you got an issue with time. Can you write me a case study? And can you give me 5 or 10 different questions I could ask to reflect on that? And I don't take them verbatim, but it's a good, then I'll work with the client and go, is this something relevant? So we're not working off a blank slate. I think that's the power of it. There's no more blank slates. There's no more blank cursors. Fill it up. This is a part of the work in public thing. Share it. How can you improve it? And then take it to the workshop.
Yeah, I often refer to thinking of it as another teammate. And I think it'll show up more and more like that, the more sophisticated it gets. And so not only are we using the tools, but really we're collaborating with them.
We're facilitating with it. And honestly, I'm back to, I think us facilitators are like the best users of as in terms of prompt. We are maybe prompt engineers. Maybe we've been doing it our whole lives. We're just now, we're prompting groups, right? And so the questions that I've asked, I had someone actually ask me, they go, how did you do that? And I sent them my 50-page Google Doc of the transcript. I'm like, wow, I wouldn't have even thought of those questions. And I think, maybe facilitation is again, it's just the most handiest skill to have.
Yeah, well, it's certainly you get good at asking questions for sure. It's interesting. I made a comment earlier when you were talking about the systems, and I was thinking to myself, I just said, how do we make it easier to facilitate? And then in that split second, I remember how facilitation's Latin root is facili, which is to make easy. And so literally, if keep is about making it easy for us to facilitate, it means that's us facilitating ourselves.
Oh, that's very meta. It is. I often find that we don't really invest that time and energy and effort into our own systems. Like we'll give it everything away for the client and do whatever they want. Back to that whole parent, adult, child thing. But after a workshop, we're usually tired. We haven't really prepped enough. And I think the systems, I think you're right. It's a really good observation, Douglas, that we're making it easier for ourselves. I don't want to start a new thread here, but because I was, when I was asking and giving out fees and I'm thinking maybe this fee's a bit too much, but they've accepted, I've got to make it hard for myself. That was a weird mindset thing I had that sometimes still crops up. But
it's interesting. Earlier, we were talking about when folks are just getting started, one of the challenges is the fear of going off the rails. And so putting too much in there because there's not going to be enough, or detailing it so finely that it's just gives you no freedom to move. Also, what you just described is another big Achilles heel I've seen folks suffer from, which is this strong drive for perfection where they over deliver. And I think it's completely unnecessary and oftentimes can be a disservice to the recipient of the workshop, even if it's not obvious. Because it's how much is really necessary?
Yeah. And I had this constant need to, I talk about the importance of adding contrast in your workshops, but sometimes there's too much contrast you can add. And basically your group are just on a roller coaster and you're just trying to keep their attention the whole time at a really high level. That was one of the traps I fell into. Yeah. And I still have to be all right, Leanne, let's take it out. Let them have that space.
Yeah. And it's not only too much content. Sometimes it can be just too much depth. How deep and thoughtful and nuanced does the prompt need to be? Did you just spend 2 days crafting this thing that's got so much intellectual depth to it that is lost on everyone? Then, is there any value? And did someone get confused because of the nuance? Is the nuance confusing anyone? I think that stuff's worth the calibrating is so important, I guess is the point I was trying to make.
I think calibration is the word. I think because often when you're thinking about the perfectionist trait, that's about you as, you putting on the show versus in service of the group. And there's the distinction.
Yeah. And it comes back to the metrics that we were talking about with, are we measuring ourselves? Do we even know how we were measuring ourselves, or not only ourselves, but the outcomes of the session? How's the business benefiting? How's the team benefiting? Ultimately, why are we doing this?
Why?
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that you linked it back. Well done.
So if we keep doing this work, like when you think about the future and what all this creates for us in the world, what are the dreams that are made possible in your mind?
Look, the dreams are, I think what we're doing is extremely important work given where we're headed as a society in terms of like the screen time and everything else. So I think what we're crafting is just incredibly meaningful experiences. One of my missions, I should put a number against this, but it's to stamp out boring workshops around the world forever. Because I think if you do have the opportunity to bring teams together or people together, that's kind of sacred time. So how do you get, and this isn't about getting the biggest ROI, but how do you make it more meaningful and, a once in a lifetime opportunity for them? So I think what's interesting now, even in Australia where we had COVID in my state didn't hit so hard, but there's still there's no hybrid, there's no virtual, it's back to all in-person sessions, which is quite interesting. It's kind of swung the other way, even though we've had all this technology improvement and know that virtual workshops can work to a degree. So I think it's just that, we hold a really important place in society. I think it's really important that we continue building the perception of what we can do and how it can benefit society and the world.
I couldn't have said that better. And as we come to a close, I want to leave you with an opportunity to leave our listeners with a final thought.
I think I'm going to play on, in The Coaching Habit, Michael Bungay Sr. talks about being a lazy leader. And I think as facilitators, why don't we strive to be a bit lazier in the way that we design our workshops using systems, like backing it up, not saying doing a poor job, doing a great job, but just stepping back a bit, letting the group fill that space. So I guess that's my probably call links into everything we spoke about, the work in public stuff as well, is like be a bit lazy. I don't have to have all the answers or a final solution.
Ah, yes, the lazy facilitator. I'm a big fan. Excellent, Leanne. Great words. It was a pleasure chatting with you today, and I look forward to another chat soon. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Control the Room. Don't forget to subscribe to receive updates when new episodes are released. If you want to know more, head over to our blog where I post weekly articles and resources about facilitation, team dynamics, and collaboration, voltagecontrol.com.